Hey, I wanted to give a trigger warning that in this episode, we do discuss suicide and suicide attempts. If this is something that is difficult for you, please pass on this episode, and we'll see you next time.
My name's Jake, and I am a stand-up comic in Buffalo, New York, which is important to this story. In November of I met a woman named Jen Orr, who came around to the open mics in Buffalo and before long started performing comedy. And then the summer of 2020, when the pandemic hit, we ended up just hanging out and started a romantic relationship, dating, falling in love. And right off the start, she was very open about her mental health struggles, that she had been diagnosed bipolar for well over 20 years at that point. And, as a young teenager, she was diagnosed, and it was very clear that she enjoyed, we both enjoyed drinking and, miscellaneous activities, but, you don't really realize it's masking something until you get to know someone's personality with and without it. So it wasn't, she was very open, like I said, about her mental health, but then probably 5 months into dating, she had lost her grandma. And I sort of got a glimpse into how drugs and alcohol played with her mental health, and kind of got a real taste of the bipolar disorder. And it didn't change anything other than I kind of realized how serious it was. And then, we ended up dating for a total of 2 years, but during the pandemic, most of the pandemic, she didn't have a job. So she ended up getting a job at a local music venue in Buffalo. She fell in love with it. It was a job that was perfect for someone who loves adrenaline. It was a job where you could drink during events, when you work during events. So that was kind of a problem, but she poured her heart and soul into the job, eventually lost the job in June of 2022 after asking for a raise. So it was sort of a very unjust situation where she ended up getting the labor board involved. And that just started a terrible spiral into her mental health decline, to the point where just a couple months later, while we were, she was house sitting for our landlady, and her mental health had started to get real poor, and she was texting me things. She ended up texting me a text message that straight up said, "I'm going to kill myself in September."
Holy shit.
That turned into, obviously I was very high alert. We would talk about things. And then that September, there was an incident where she came home drunk, woke me up, an argument ensued. Things got very scary, to where there was an attempt with knives, and she had to go to the hospital and get stitched up. And that put her whole family back on alert. Her family had dealt with this the whole time. So they, had stories of things being really dark. So this was just one of those instances of, okay, we're paying attention again. Like, what's going on, kiddo? And then I ended up telling her family about the text message, because at that point I had not. And then her brother agreed that we should get crisis services involved. And that was a situation where I realized because she had always told me how bad the mental health care was, especially in New York State. And she had experienced it in other states like Minnesota and Massachusetts, because she had lived elsewhere. But this was an instance where I realized that even a text message that said she had intention to kill herself was, mental health crisis services straight up told us she's just seeking attention. And that was, yeah. So Jen was amazing at talking her way in and out of things, but this was like, hey, we have a text message here. And, that was a moment where I realized, okay, this is all up to her now. And that, part of mental health illness that people don't realize is, when things get bad, people try to push you away. And this had begun her really trying to push everyone away. And, we had been living together for well over a year at this point. So she was kind of stuck with me and had tried pushing me away, but it got to the point where I was like, listen, I'm here with you. What you're going through is obviously tough, but like, the drinking has to stop. Like, it turned into hey, it's okay to not be okay, but like, the way you're dealing with it needs to change. So I tried to just show support. And after that incident, I stopped drinking, just
After
for
the
clarity.
September incident?
Yeah. So she kind of thought that I was just trying to be like, oh, if I can do it, you can do it. When it was more like, no, I
Uh,
need to do this for myself too. So, and it turned into where she had realized she had never lived a life without alcohol. And
mm,
for someone to realize that, you know, your whole life is now going to be trying not to drink or trying not to do drugs. Like, it's not something that just goes away after a year of not doing it or 20 years of not doing it. So it was very clear that she was overwhelmed and intimidated by changing the addiction and the alcoholism. And she admitted to me through text that drinking was a problem and that she knew she had to change. But she was seeking therapists, you know, doing all the quote unquote right things. They were putting her on crazy medications. You know, I was witnessing all of this where she was having severe panic attacks. And again, this was nothing new for her. She was like just screaming for help. But the thing was with the crisis services is the two options were, you know, you go to ECMC, which is a living hell for anyone who's ever been there, or, you know, do what she did and talk your way out of it. So,
mm,
you know, she was trying so hard, working so hard, and for the last year at this point was dealing with her mother, you know, no longer being a part of the family, and, you know, her mother having a new relationship. So she was grieving, you know, people who were still alive. She was grieving her grandmother. She was dealing with the loss of a career and just feeling completely lost. And with COVID and everything, like, she was just an understandable storm of emotions. And, you know, from September to November, she was working really hard on herself. And there was still a couple moments where she tried pushing me away to the point where I would pack up my things to leave. And she was like, do you really want this? And I was like, no, but this needs to change. You can't be kicking me out of our own home. And all these things
mm,
where she was really trying. And then we had this weekend in November planned where we, you know, every day of the weekend, we were just going to do something, go out to a comedy show or go to the Bills game and whatnot. And then everything kind of resurfaced. Like, her mom reached out to her and just, she started drinking that weekend, and it just turned into just the arguments, the wanting to fight about this, fight about that. And that weekend, you know, it just, everything resurfaced to the point where she was trying to push me away again. And then, you know, that Monday, Tuesday, I was like, okay, whatever then. Like, it is what it is. And she went out that Monday night. And again, I just stayed home, slept, and then didn't even really hear her come home, but woke up the next morning and came downstairs, was walking down the stairs, and found that she had taken her own life and hung herself.
uh,
So it was completely, I mean, the first thought to cross my mind was, you didn't. No, you didn't do it. You didn't do it. You didn't do it. But in the meantime, also being like, this was exactly what we were scared of. So while you are still scared of it happening, once it happens, you're still like, no, you can't, this can't be real, to the point where
mm,
like part of your brain is just like, no, she's still breathing. She's okay. And right away, you know, I called her brother, who I had no idea because she wasn't talking to him, and he was not even in town. He was in Vegas. So he ended up calling, you know, their dad, and then I called 911. They showed up. The fireman right away was like, you know, this is a suicide. And they told me, like, on the phone, like, I had permission to cut her down. And so, like, she was laying there, and but the cops showed up, and then it right away turned into, obviously, like, they don't know what's going on. So I'm
yeah.
a quote unquote suspect. And,
Oh
you
my
know,
God.
they don't tell you that. So as like, you know, I'm like trying to get a shirt on. They're like following me around. This cop takes me outside, and he's like, you know, I need your name and number. Or, you know, just, he's just grilling me. But as soon as we get outside, her dad's already there. And he's just, you know, I give him a hug. And this, like, was crazy, but it literally is like what stopped the quote unquote investigation. As her dad just said, you know, you were the best thing that ever happened to her, and asked how
Mm,
she took her life. He goes, did she just like take a bunch of pills or what? And then I told him, and then he obviously understandably broke down, and right away the cop's demeanor changed. So that whole part of it right there was like, wow, even in the one instance when you just need someone to give you a hug, like, the police don't give a fuck. And it is what it is. Like, I get it, everyone has a job to do, But even after he like understood what had happened, there was no sensitivity at all. And, then I still have to talk to an investigator and all these
Yeah.
things where, you tell them, hey, we reached out to you guys and nothing happened. And like they just try so hard with the, well, were you guys arguing? Were this, that, has she hit you? Have you? And you're like, dude, like I already went through all this with, mental health resources. So,
Right.
and within like a minute of me stepping out of the house, a woman with two officers next to her hands me a card to seek mental health help. And I'm just like, the person that needed this is in a body bag right now. Like,
Yeah.
so it was just right away very, very intense where I was just realizing, that even when things go terribly wrong, like there's no help from, the people that are supposed to help you sometimes. And so that was, a Tuesday in November 15th, 2022. And, obviously I have not been the same person since. But obviously there's so many layers to the story, but that's like the quickest way I think I could describe what happened.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's very intense. I guess to take it back a little bit, that text that you received in September, like
Yeah.
what is the thoughts and the reaction to something like that?
I called her right away and was kind of like, hey, like this is a serious thing to text someone, because she had texted it in a way where like you have to press on it to reveal it, which I didn't even know was an iPhone feature at the time.
Oh,
So I was kind of
interesting.
like, hey, you could still take a screenshot of it, but I was like, hey, like, what's this about here? And she had so far said, like she had a plan to drive the car off a cliff, but the dog she was watching is what kept her from doing it. So I was like, okay, so
Holy shit.
this is pretty
Yeah.
serious. Like she has, a plan in place. And, if I'm being honest, from like the point of September to November, I'm sure there was time, because there was times she would just sleep in so late when because I was working, that there was times looking back on it, I was like, oh, she definitely tried to take too many pills. And that's the reason why I think when she finally decided to do it, it was going to be a foolproof method. So,
Hmm.
because it was just, this poor woman was living, a living hell every day. And it was just, and towards the end as well, she just kept telling me she loved me a lot, which was kind of like,
Mm.
looking back on it, you're like, oh, okay. Like she's saying goodbye, maybe in a weird sense. So, as far as the reason I don't think I told anyone right away is because I wanted to give her a chance to kind of be like, hey, like, what do you think I'm supposed to do with this information other
Hmm.
than do
Yeah.
what you keep saying is not going to help? And because, she would just keep saying, there's no hope, there's no help. This is what they do to you and all this stuff. And so it was just like, I was like, well, if she's tried everything, what do I know?
Yeah.
Right. Especially if she's been dealing with it her whole life or damn near
Right.
her whole life. Holy shit. So then 2 months go by, and then waking up to that horrific event.
Yeah.
Um, when that happened, and they said you can cut her down. Like when you said that,
Yeah.
how do you even
Yeah. I
like
wouldn't even.
find the strength to be able to do that?
Everyone talks about the whole living in the moment thing. And as someone with pretty intense anxiety, I've learned that when you don't have time to think about stuff, you stay pretty calm.
Oh, interesting.
And for whatever reason, because they kept asking me these questions, I'm like, I don't know. Can I just cut her down? And they're like, yeah, of course. So in that instance, something in my brain was like, Jake, this is the last time like anyone's gonna hold her. Like this is like although this is a horrific moment, it's still the end of her story. And I was just, what sucks so bad is I was like, wow, if this is gonna happen and I'm the person to do it, like this is,
Mm,
like unfortunately a huge honor for someone that I found so beautiful and amazing and was so in love with, that I remembered it in a way. Like I read something about a woman like kind of pulling the plug on her husband, so to speak. Like she was there when he died in the hospital and she didn't tell the nurse for like an hour. And I think like her explanation of how death, although so terrible, and these are two different situations, it's still a beautiful thing because they're no longer here. Their spirit's gone somewhere else. So in a way, I was just so careful that I was like, I just, like I said, just took it as some weird honor of, I know that this is the end and I don't want it to be, but this is what it is. And
Yeah.
what's kind of crazy about it is that, like, because she was dead weight, her foot put a hole in the wall at the bottom of the stairs. And until like maybe this past winter, I hadn't, because I am a house painter by trade and I kind of learned how to do wall repair. And it was in a spot where like no one who walked by it could see it except for me, but it was big enough that like you could stick a couple fingers in it or whatever. So I mean it was noticeable, but not if you didn't look down at it. So I finally like filled that hole, and just it seemed like such a
Hmm.
metaphor of, although this hole is no longer gone, like that wall is never the same, and it's always going to have that fucked up part that happened to it. And so like it was just such a mind-blowing thing to think about that having to do with taking her down. And like I said, I think anyone who would be like a lot of people throughout this have said, I could never imagine. And I go, I don't want you to, but you wouldn't know until you're in that situation what you would do.
That's right. Yeah, it's very much like there you don't have a choice. Like a lot of people are just like, "Oh, I don't want to be in your shoes," or "I can never do that." And it's like,
Yeah.
but you don't have a choice, and
No.
you do
You would
just
do
go.
it.
Yeah, you would.
Mm-hmm.
You would just do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think there is something like I think what touched me the most is when you're describing that is I think it is a beautiful moment in the midst of tragedy. Like
Yes.
just being able to hold her and carry her. Like when my wife passed, the kids and I had our last moment with her, and
Mm-hmm.
then we left, and other people cleaned her up and got her ready to go. But like there is something very beautiful about being able to kind of have that moment with you
Right.
two before the chaos starts. Now there's so many, like I am curious about kind of the experience of the mental health services and the failure of that, but we don't have to talk about that if that's not something you want to or feel equipped to.
No, I am more than willing. Real quick. Like the thing is I've because she hid this from so many close people to her. I all this like once it happened, I quickly turned into just having to explain, not having to, but feeling the responsibility to explain it to all these people because she was such a light and it was a blind side for so many people. So I am unfortunately, more
Oh.
than comfortable to talk. Like I talked to at least over 100 people about it in depth right after it happened. So I'm pretty comfortable talking about as much as you need to.
Yeah, just I'm curious the experience of the failure. So we've had other guests who have had different medical situations, and I think it's very enlightening to hear kind of the failures of our systems, and specifically in the United States are the folks that we've talked to. So in regards to like her seeking out help and having an actual text and a history of like diagnosis and potential attempts, like what is their criteria then to say, okay, we're gonna help? Or is it more that she was able to convince them that she didn't need help?
Well, the huge part of it in New York State is they consider mental health and drug and addiction two different things, although they
Hmm.
almost all the time coincide and overlap. So with her situation, because the instance with the knives happened while she was intoxicated, that's what made it very difficult to have to prove what
Damn.
they had to prove unless she just voluntarily went. And because there was knives and quote unquote weapons involved, the police had to come. So we basically were staging an intervention while waiting for the police.
Holy
And
shit.
she, a very liberal minded woman and always good at backing up her opinion on things, was very anti police. So it got to the point where her brother had to be like, we're waiting for the police. Like that's what we're waiting for. Is once the police get here, then these people can come in and talk to you. And it
um,
was well over 2 hours because she was just mocking the whole situation, which I could not blame her. But even beyond that, her sister Megan had talked about how there was a night where Jen was in her early 20s, desperately like, I'll go, just take me wherever. And her sister went to three different private places and they just would not let her in, whether it was because of her age, her insurance, whatever it was. And Jen had shared experiences with me in Massachusetts when she was in college, how her friend had a straight up mental breakdown and no questions asked. They took care of it. Their facilities were just somehow better and
Oh
they,
shit.
diagnosed them properly. So she had seen mental health and she had, I'm sure, had instances where her mental health, she had to get help in Massachusetts. She had seen where it can work and where, in New York State, you're just like, you literally go into ECMC, you see people rubbing their own shit on the walls and you go, you know what? I can go home and figure this out. I cannot be in this environment. Like, it's just the horror. And it's, again, like with the crisis services, it's no one's fault. There's lacks of resources. People are overworked. They're
I see.
tired. And then, like, when the police finally showed up, there was three officers. Two of them were just chit chatting, and the one stood by me and actually asked, like, "So what happened?" And like actually gave a shit. And so it's just from top to bottom, just it's no one's fault.
Yeah.
But because we did end up meeting with some political officials after the fact, and the problem is the laws with mental health and addiction kind of not being, you have to treat them separately, even though they basically told, because we ended up asking, well, what do we do if she's displaying this behavior while she's drunk? And they go, well, then the police would take her away. So so it was just, that was the big flaw, is the two things that should go hand in hand were just, they're treated separately by
It's
law.
almost like they're each pointing at the other, and it's like, well, they have to go do it. Well, the police have to do it. The mental service has to do it. And it like sounds like there's no nuance. It's like either these extreme mental break cases with, people rubbing shit on the wall, whereas like there's a spectrum of care that needs to happen. And so it sounds like a lack of resources. That fucking sucks so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
So so much is going through my mind right now. Before I forget, so I want to go back to kind of that moment that you had with her dad, but I want to ask first, are you still performing stand up, and have you since you lost her?
Oh yeah. So on Tuesdays I actually co-host a room with my best friend I went to high school with. And it's right at walking distance from where Jen and I lived and where I still live. And so that it happened on a Tuesday, the night we're supposed to do that. And so, like, yes, I still do it. And the not drinking part, because I haven't drank since, has made it such a different experience where I'm just so grateful to get to do it, especially with everything going on in the world and people having so little freedoms in a lot of places, that the fact that I get to just go up and say what's on my mind, but also feeling the responsibility to make people not feel as shitty as I do sometimes is something I really enjoy as a responsibility. And, like, the ego is the big thing right now because people can just pop off with social media and get a viral moment. That egos are flying around all the time. And I'm just, after everything with Jen and with my grief journey, stand up and comedy has just made me so grateful to just be alive. And like, there's been so many moments where I've been in front of like 4 people, but they're all paying attention. And it's like, wow, these people might remember part of this for the rest of their life. And it's brought me opportunities and moments I've never thought imaginable. So yes, I've continued doing it.
Yeah, I think you answered, but I'll ask anyways, is like, has doing stand up, has it changed since she passed? Do you bring in your grief into your stand up, into your routine?
So my humor had always been dark, and Jen had a dark sense of humor. So whenever we could laugh about dark mental health and suicide, we would. And although I feel long far, if ever, able to talk about suicide jokes, I don't know. But seeing other comics, especially ones I admired, being able to do it, it brings so much therapy to me. So I try to just stay away from it because I'm just not good at it yet. If I don't know if I ever will be, but I appreciate it to the point that I did reach out to this comic in LA who has some amazing clips of these jokes talking about, attempting and whatnot. And, I messaged him basically saying, I'm sure you get a lot of, people that don't. I basically just informed him, how it helped me and how I want him to just keep sharing stuff like this because it makes you vulnerable, but it's very important. And he told me how many friends he had lost to suicide, and it was in the 20s just in the last couple of
Holy
years.
Oh my
shit.
God.
And
Wow.
and the thing that like really stuck out to me is a phrase I've heard so many times, but hearing it from him say everything good and bad is temporary. And that applies to comedy itself so much because of the highs and lows of performing that, you just when someone says, "Hey man, that was a great set," in the back of your head, you're just like, "Yeah, but the next one might suck." Like you're just
Yeah.
never satisfied. And that's helped me just also enjoy the moment. And the thing is too, because there are so many mentally ill people doing comedy, let alone in Buffalo, that I hear people all the time. Like you could get an easy laugh by just saying, "Oh, I want to kill myself right now." It's
Yeah.
crazy. It's crazy how that will just get people to laugh. And I have people come up to me all the time and they say something like that. And I just look at them and I just go, well, guess what, man? Like this could all end in 5 minutes anyways. And they're just like, oh, wow. So,
Yeah. Puts it into perspective.
I deal with the weird mental, like people not realizing what they're saying all the time, as far as like, it's just so good and bad how there's just so well crafted suicide jokes. And then some very like, you didn't mean that. Like, what are you doing? Sort of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, not elevating the discussion, but just using it
Yeah.
as a cheap
Mhm.
imitation for true humor. But it is like, yeah, it's fascinating to me because so I have a very dark sense of humor as well. And my wife did, and we
You
used
don't
humor to
say.
cope. Yeah, right.
Yes.
We used humor to cope, and specifically stand up. So, I like when I tell people that comedy and humor is important to me, like I don't think people understand the gravity of that, especially like in grief, where when so I have 3 children and we told them, my wife had cancer, but she had it for 6 years before she passed. And when we told them like, hey, this is it, there's no more medicine, there's nothing more we can do. We cried together, we held together as a family, and literally the next moment we put stand up on. And my kids were
Mhm.
young, but like that's what we did. And we allowed ourselves to laugh and to find solace in people who are elevating kind of some of these heavier topics as well. So I think it's really beautiful to hear. I mean, I can almost like feel it from you, like how you have used that to help in your journey. So taking it back to that moment when you discovered her and then these police are grilling you and making a difficult situation even worse.
Yeah.
And then her father kind of saying those things to you. What happened to you when he said those things? Like, did you take it in? Did you understand what he was saying?
I was so heartbroken where I was just like, I was like, because then her sister came and the first thing she was like, "You were home," and like I knew what she
Oh,
meant,
Oh.
but
mm,
it was just like I let everyone down, which I know wasn't the case
oh, fuck,
because
man.
what's
No.
crazy is when I came home that night, this happened like early in the morning. I came home that night after going to her parents' house, and I came home. And like I said, the police were in here for a while. So for this to happen, where I open the door and I see a piece of the fabric that she used to, and I see the piece of fabric, a giant piece of it too. Like it was not there by coincidence. And I just saw it and I picked it up and I like threw it out right away. I called my sister and I was like, "Yo, I'm freaked out right now."
Yeah.
And she
Yeah.
goes, "Jake, go in the garbage and take that out." And that was just me realizing Jen was telling me, "Hey dude, like you have nothing to do with this. Like
Wow.
this was
Yeah.
all me, man." Like that's all I could take from that moment. And that was just as soon as I found that, it all hit where I was like, all the things we said we were going to do aren't going to happen. And that was like just the worst feeling in the world. But, you know, like I said, I spent most of the wake and funeral just consoling people because that's all I knew how to do. I had lived with it so close for the last couple months that everything she was scared of people finding out, they were finding out. And that's what like really sucked.
Oh,
And
right.
even the night, and what's tough is you have to deal with how everyone else is dealing with it. And one of the things that happened, I found out the night she did pass, everyone went to the place that we would be at for comedy anyways. And sort of, once they found out the news, like a bunch of her friends had gathered, and word had gotten out how she had taken her life. And because like a month before that, she had been published in the paper speaking out against a former music venue she had worked at, someone thought, oh no, she never would have done that. Someone must have murdered her, which is,
Oh gosh.
yeah. So this is like a rumor I'm hearing through the grapevine, but it's one of those situations where you go back to any time a celebrity kills themselves, and it's always turns into the conspiracy. Oh, the government had them killed. And I was finally understanding that from this terrible situation that, this is just how people cope, and I can't get mad about it. But it got to the point where they were asking neighbors for cameras and footage. So it was, you take it personally a little bit, because you're like, hey dude, I was there.
That's crossing a line.
Yeah. So
people are just really nosy.
Right. And that's the terrible part about it. But there was just parts of a lot of uncomfortable situations where I learned to I have to be comfortable here. I just have to deal with it. And, obviously, like, you deal with, I don't know if you had to deal with the CJ, but like I did have to deal with ex-boyfriends and people that I've heard terrible stories about, where I was, just hugging them and just putting aside whatever emotions I may have had, but everything in me, because Jen we finished each other's sentences. That's how, we were soulmates. So like I could just hear her in my head the whole time, and still do every day. But like, just as I was going through the process, just hear things like, hey man, just give him a hug. Like, just tell him you love him. Like, just this stuff that would probably sound insane to anyone else, but it was just the only thing I could think to do in this time. And, I was like, I'll have my own moments to deal with this, but right now, like, these people are just surprised, where I'm also surprised, but I unfortunately was here for it every step of the way.
Yeah.
So, it was just, that's where I was like, okay, I can talk about, people deserve to know, just so they don't take it personal, because so many people did. They're like, oh, I could have done something. And that's the part you can't stand.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that a lot of it maybe because she was so good at hiding it?
She was just the happiest, they wrote in her obituary, they quoted me as saying, like, you could hear her before you saw her in a room. And she was just a naturally loud person in the best way. But, that was like, you would hear her and just feel this sense of comfortability, and she would hug you. Like, she was just one of those people that made you feel so happy when you walked in a room. And if she was meeting you there were so many people that said, I only met her once, but she, it was the most memorable meeting. And so she was just a huge impact on the community, that I was meeting people I'd never met. I'd only heard stories from and about. So, which also shows how much she cared about so many people. So yes, that was the thing, is she was so good at hiding it. But unfortunately, from where she grew up in South Buffalo, a lot of people could relate to what she'd went through, had seen it, had gone through it, but you kind of just have to be tough. That's the stigma with, mental health, is just bury it and keep going.
Yeah. Which is wild. In 2024, we're still having this like inability to see that it's an injury just as much as another injury, for lack of a better word. Now, it's interesting to hear you like describe it. It's like you're seeing these people, you know some of like how they have been, so maybe there's not so great people, and having to essentially just show them love and compassion. And there's this idea that grief is this container that we hold, that we have when we experience these things, and to the depths that we can feel our grief is the same depths that we can feel love, compassion, and joy. And I wonder, like, in those moments, if the depths of what you were feeling was enabling you to have like this extraordinary type of compassion that maybe you otherwise didn't have before. And that gave you kind of that strength to do that. But moving forward, after kind of everything settles down, I'm assuming it was probably a little bit longer for things to settle down because of the nature. And then it sounds like you said people were like acting a fool about trying to get camera footage and all that shit. So as life began to begin again, what was that experience of rediscovering who you are post death and in your grief?
So what was very unique about my experience is right before she passed, I had sort of asked her permission to work for one of her very good friends who was starting his own painting company. And at the time, he had another one of their best friends working. So the two people I had worked with every day were also pallbearers at her funeral. That's like
Oh,
how close
wow.
they were. So one of those two buddies, 2 days after Jen passed away, his wife decided she wanted a divorce after only 2 months of marriage. So there was this extreme situation where I was working every day with two of her best friends. One of them was going through a very quick divorce or a divorce after a very quick marriage. So all three of us were just going through a whirlwind of emotions. And it got to the point where his mental health started to decline rapidly. And I
Holy
had to
shit.
sort of have an intervention with him at a point where I felt like I was not the guy to tell you, hey, man, you need to get your head straight. But like what had happened was, we had gotten in an argument, me and this buddy, and we went home and for the weekend, and I went out with some friends to do a show or something. And I remember drinking some mushroom tea, and I get home, and this is the craziest thing, but there was two full water bottles, and I get home, and one of them was completely flipped over, like that,
No way.
standing straight up on the cap, like a full water
No.
bottle. And I just stared at it and was terrified. Obviously was something that was not there before. And then I
Yeah.
started laughing because I was like, okay, this is a sign of whatever. So I just laid on the bed and like looked up and I was like, yo, dude, like what's the message here? And it was, so then I reached out to my buddy and I ended up talking. It got to the point where they sent me to stage an intervention with him to go get his head straight.
No
And
way.
it kind of felt like I had this moment where I could kind of not redeem myself, but like kind of do it differently for someone else who also, because he had lost his brother to suicide. So it was just this very weird situation of, okay, Jake, like you have to just talk. And it just comes down to how we're all dealing with trauma. We're not diagnosing and just all these things where it was just so quick that that kind of put my healing process on hold. And it got to the point where later that summer, him and I had a falling out, and he basically like told me I was the one that made him want to kill himself.
Oh
And
my
No.
gosh.
just out of a pure argument. So, and I only bring this up because it's something where I'm like, is this really happening as part of like this whole grief thing? And it was something I really had to like heal within myself and
Mm.
just like say, Jake, like, hey man, like just it taught me how I had to start keeping my circle tighter and just taking more care of myself. And then, but something that happened within a month of Jen passing that was a very eye-opening experience as far as the spiritual realm of things is that because as soon as someone very close to you passes, I did lose my dad in November of 2019. So I had some experience with grief, but you do automatically just want to know that their spirit is somewhere. Like you just feel like
Yeah.
this sense of like there is no afterlife, there's no nothing, like I just need something. And so right after Jen passed away, I told my sister, she lived in New York City, I was going to go visit her for what, like just go to a show in New York City to just feel like I got away for a moment where no one would know me in New York City, far enough away. And I remember getting on a train early in the morning and I was ready to just fall asleep and close my eyes for however long. And then the first stop in Rochester, this guy gets on and he's a intimidating man, comes all the way to the back of the train for some reason, sits next to me, is clearly very like excited and nervous and whatnot. I can't sit still. And then within like 10 minutes starts talking to me, just small talk. And all of a sudden, just out of nowhere says, yeah, this is my first time traveling since I got out of prison. He goes,
Oh my gosh. Wow.
he goes, I spent the last 30 years in prison for murder. And I was like, all right.
Wow.
I was like, so this is going to be an interesting conversation. And then I'm just not phased because she would always quote the Muppets Take Manhattan and say, people's is people's. So I was just so used to just talking to whoever about anything. But then he's explaining to me all about the prison system. I go, hey man, like just to save you some breath, I grew up, my dad was a corrections officer. And he goes, where? And it turns out it was
No
one of the
way.
prisons he had spent a
No
significant amount of
fucking
time in.
way.
Yeah, so I ended up pulling up a picture of my dad, and he was like, "Oh, I remember him," and explains how he used to make the belts, the baton holders, all this stuff. And I immediately remembered being a kid, and like the one thing I was obsessed with on my dad's work belt was like this pouch he carried the medical gloves in. I was like, "Oh shit!" I go, "I wonder if this is the guy that made that thing I was for whatever reason
No
obsessed of as a
fucking
kid."
way.
Yeah, so it was just this wild interaction. We're on the train the whole time. We ended up like smoking a couple cigarettes together. He ends up giving me like a hand rolled gifted cigar, which I don't even think he remembered, but that was his vice, was cigars. So he gives me this giant cigar. I think I like traded him a couple joints or something as a thank you. And he ends up going, "Hey man, the train's filling up. Can I like sit next to you? Let's let like this couple sit." So he ends up, I go, "Okay man, but I want the window seat." And I ended up he was just so excited to tell me stories, and he told me his whole story about what he did and this, that, and everything. But I like fell asleep as he was talking to me, is how tired I was. And I just think back on it, like I don't know many people that would just so confidently fall asleep next to someone that had
A
told them,
convicted murder. Yeah.
yeah, they were capable of taking a human life, and they knew that. So I get to New York City, and I like tell my mom and my sister, I was like, "Hey, like I don't think you believe this." So that was like the first realization that, okay, they're looking out for me. Jen and my dad are looking out for me. And then but it was so then going through my own healing process with the mental health thing, like it kept reappearing that friends weren't doing good, that I was in these situations where I needed to, somehow console them. And then it gets to the point where the 1 year anniversary of her passing comes up, and like the only real therapy I'd done was like this group therapy through like a church that was in an old Sears, like something bananas, something free that was just a group therapy with all these older people that had lost their spouse of 30 some years. So I was still just lost, and still doing comedy sober and having, or off of alcohol I should say, and having positive experiences, but just not finding that enjoyment anymore, where I'm just like
Mm.
really struggling to have like a moment where I'm happy to be alive. And then the 1 year comes, it was very difficult, but then like right around New Year's, it was like the night before New Year's Eve, and I went to a show. I could walk down the street to this venue to see these two bands that Jen and I had actually seen right before she passed for like our anniversary. It was like these two local bands we loved, and I remember just having this profound moment where I was just like, the music was just so intense and enjoyable that I just had this moment where I was like, man, you get to exist during this time when like all these beautiful things exist, when these three guys in front of you somehow met and are making this incredible music, and just this
Mm.
finally having that moment of like, wow, all these emotions I felt are a beautiful thing, like you said, because we're so complex, because we're humans, and there's so much more than just the day-to-day stuff. And yes, it's a survival of the fittest, but there's just so much beauty that I finally felt that sense of, okay, I'm back to enjoying things and not feeling like this cloud is going to be here forever. And it's now this summer and everything, I'm finally going out and doing things again, and just buying tickets for things and figuring out the day of, who's going to go, what's going to happen, and whatnot. But it's still to the point where you're there and you hear these things. You're like, damn it, Jen, if you just a little bit longer, you could be here with me. And
Yeah.
just a lot
Yeah.
of those moments have happened. And I just talked to her brother Brendan about it the other day, and he said something. He goes, but then, part of your brain says, well, with these bad things going on in the world, how would she be reacting to that? And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, you have to just hope
Yeah.
that at this point she would have been better. That's just, you just assume she would have been better. And that's what it all comes down to. And I just, when it comes, I just constantly think about how do we fix mental health, wellness, and I don't think that there's ever really an answer from a medical standpoint, at least not for me to say, but life has just given me so many little interactions with people of different walks of life that just making someone feel heard is like the biggest game changer. And just, we're so overwhelmed with, oh, you got to help these foreign nations with their problems and these wars and it's like, but you forgot about the person right next to you who's just barely keeping it together. And I've just had so many of these beautiful moments with people just going through it where they're just like, how are you so happy? And, I have to tell them, like, it feels like I've seen the finish line. Like when it comes down to, death and the funeral and all this stuff. And it's, best quoted by Ricky Gervais, where dying is like being dumb. You don't know what happened, but it sucks for the people around you. And like, that was the tough part, is just there's certain people, that remember Jen in the smallest of ways. And there's people like me and her family who just can't stop thinking about her. And that's the thing where you just have to figure out how you're gonna honor them, and that's the thing, is she was just so good at making people not feel sad, that it's like, you know what, I can still do that. And that's what I'm going to keep doing. And it's just so, you can do it just by asking someone how they're doing. It's so easy just to be like, how was your day? And people will just be like, you know what, it's been all right. So
yeah. So many people don't genuinely ask, how are you? It's more of like just a turn of phrase. But yeah, I mean, what we need the most is just to feel heard. And I think that goes a long way, because I've observed the same thing in all walks of my life, work, personal, all that stuff, where you see people and you think they have it together. But if you just sit down for 5 minutes, you realize nobody really does. And we're just figuring out as we go. But when we look around and it seems like everybody has it together, that makes things harder. But if we could just see that people are struggling, it helps us to know that we're not alone. And I think just not feeling alone goes so far for us.
And, I heard a comic say, they were talking about like being raised by a single mother, and they had the realization that your parents are all doing it for the first time. Like everyone's just doing everything for the first time. And it's just, that's the thing I keep reminding myself, is although there's people that have great advice, it's not necessarily going to work for you. So
that's right. You have to find what works for you.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's like this idea of like, we're swimming in our grief and we have to find our way to shore, and that getting to shore is different for each person. Like I've realized for me right now, it's being present-minded, present-focused to love and appreciation, which is a counterbalance to the way that my grief was being expressed, which was anger and frustration. So a lot of what I hear from you is becoming focused on what's in front of you, the band, and finding the enjoyment in life. And it's funny, you said you would buy tickets. So I did that for probably at least a year, where I would just buy 2 tickets to every comedy show that I wanted to go to, every stand-up show. And I would just be like, a week before, hey, I got a ticket. Someone want to go with me? If they didn't, I went alone. If they did, great. I'd have somebody to go with. But like, it was
I took 2 of those.
Yes, that's right. I forgot you guys did. That's right.
I took 2 of those.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like, oh yeah.
Yep, that's right. But it's finding ways to see life again, because I think what feels like a common experience is that when we have these significant moments of death in our life, and that significance could be different for each person, but it's something significant enough that we tend to lose our grasps on the future. Not that we want to or we can't see it. It doesn't exist. Like that the slate has been wiped clean, and now we have to figure out, well, who are we? And then what do we put back in that picture of the future? And it takes time. It takes time, but it takes confrontation with our grief. So in this like journey that you have been going on, which is still very recent, what are the things that you have found that have helped you kind of confront your grief and allow it to be something that you can hold versus something that crushes you?
Oh man, I would say you have to, like, it's been discussed so many times here, I think, and I think I already kind of mentioned it, but it's just you have to go through it, and you have to realize, as much as it sucks, it is a blessing to feel something
Mm,
so intense and to get to the root that it's because you miss that person, you miss all these things about that person. They're never going to be anyone remotely close to that person, and then you kind of have to come back to the thing, well, there's never going to be someone else like me either. And that's,
mm,
like these theories of that you get to choose your timeline, and just the fact that like ours happened. I was such a small blip in her timeline, but it was so impactful in mine. And to,
mm,
for that to just be the way that you can just cross paths with someone, and for there just this infinity chance of so many things happening, and to know that I got that chance with that person, and I'm now stuck with this sadness. But you know it's there's like that expression of the top of every mountain is the bottom of another, and I just keep telling myself, yeah, but the view on the mountain with Jen was just, there's never going to be a view like that again.
there's so much gratitude just pouring from you, and it's quite beautiful, Jake, and I appreciate you sharing that. You've mentioned a few times like signs and just knowing that, I believe you said your dad and then Jen were looking out for you. So
Hmm.
spirituality has been a journey for me. It's been a very bizarre and confronting journey. I'm curious if you have been to a medium, if you have, for back of a letter, back of a letter word, for lack of a better word,
Yeah.
if you have rituals or just ways that you connect back to that essence of your dad or Jen, and to bring them and keep them in your life. And that could look different for everybody, and you can insert whatever words you want there. But yeah, curious about that.
Well, I grew up, my grandma on my mom's side was, a practicing medium of sorts. Not where she
No
like,
way.
yeah, not to the point where she like took in clients, but like she had a lot of friends, that are still practicing at Lilydale and whatnot. And, people that have gone on to be very big in the community. And one story that I always remember is my dad, he was very skeptical about it. And I remember he told me they were at a restaurant. He was sitting next to my grandma, and she looks at him and looks at a spoon, and then proceeded to move the spoon without doing anything, like onto the
No.
floor. Yeah. And he goes, Jake, because he was a very Catholic, religious man. And he was like, Jake, we looked at each other, and I basically said, all right, I believe you now. So I've always been very open to that. I've been to Lilydale. I've watched my own father be like, oh shit, I think there's something to this. But
Mm,
since Jen or my dad has passed away, have not, had an appointment or met with a medium. And I would say, because Jen and I would all, call each other our puzzle piece, which I later found out is like the national symbol for autism. So I had to tell her that at one point, like, hey, just so you know, I just think like we are the perfect fit. It has nothing to do with me thinking
yeah.
you're autistic. So like a couple times, like I don't know how to describe it, but like one time I had to go through one of her things, and there was a single puzzle piece in there. And then,
No way.
one time like a puzzle piece came flying out of nowhere when I was cleaning up at work, real pissed off one day, like just certain instances like that.
That's so
But
cool.
then the thing I would say has been very profound between my dad and her is just whether it's music or comedy or just art in general, it's felt like they've come through to me. With a perfect example being, there was this movie. I remember I almost watched it with Jen, but it was too heavy of a topic. It's called Four Good Days, and it has Mila Kunis and Glenn Close in it, and Glenn Close is her mother, and it's based off of an article actually. But one day I just watched it. I think it was like this past winter, and I just watched it. And right off the start, it's a very intense movie about addiction, and it just starts with the daughter who. I never once thought Jen resembled this actress Mila Kunis at any point, or Mila, and as soon as they show her in this movie, like the look in her eyes was a look I have seen so many times in Jen's eyes. And just from the start to the end, it felt like it was, you know, her, like she was portraying her,
Wow.
from everything from the way she held a cigarette to the way there was like this one part where she was like, you know, just sitting in the garage and was like, all right, I'll open the garage door. And these people walk by and like, they like make a nasty look at her. And she goes, all right, I'm done with this. Just this attitude that Jen had. And just the movie was about her mom finally says, do you really want help this time? And they find out that there's this potential help, this medication, but she has to stay clean for, you know, a certain amount of time. And it was 4 days. So she needs to stay clean for like 4 more good days. And it just demonstrates from an addict how difficult a minute feels. And that's like the
Yeah.
approach I've had to grief, is like it's minute by minute. Like some things can change so quickly. And, you know, not drinking, and, you know, it's been like a year and a half without cigarettes. And the thing, like, when it comes down to trying not to do something, is you literally have to tell yourself, I'm not going to do this right now. Like, right now, I'm going to go do something else. And like the amount of times a day I have to say, hey, I'm not going to do this. And to know how intense that is for, you know, so many other people in this movie, there was just all these parts where if you've dealt with someone you loved who's addicted or going through a mental health crisis, you will be so drawn to it. But at the end of the movie, like the one thing she keeps trying to do to keep her mind off of drugs is putting a puzzle together. And at the very end of the movie, her and her mom put like the last puzzle piece together, and it was
Mm.
just the cry I had, and like it just ends in a way where you have hope. And I was just like, you know what? Although she's no longer here, that feeling of hope can just be applied. There's so many other Jens out there that I feel like that's how she comes through to me, is to just, you know, there's still so many other people. You know, there's a very good quote from Eat, Pray, Love about your soulmate. And like, they're meant to just break you down and show you, you know,
Mm.
the things you need to fix and how, you know, you can fix other things. And I think that's what she really did to me, was just show me how although she needed a break from this world because it was a living hell, you know, there's other people that, you know, they're still around. So
Yeah. That's
it's never
beautiful.
going to bring her back or make that better, but it's like the only thing you can kind of say to yourself is, well, there's still enough people going through this shit that, you know, I can take what I've learned and apply it there.
Yeah, and I think it's the idea you mentioned. I think it was just like how grief is the minute by minute thing, and
My
came
grandpa says
across.
that.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
says that all the time. Minute by minute.
yeah, minute by
Yeah.
minute.
Sometimes day by day is too much.
It's way too
Hmm.
much.
Just gotta make it to the next minute.
Yep.
I ran across. I can't remember what book I was reading, but the idea. There was a quote from it, and it was like every hour is a new beginning. And it just
Yes.
like, it stuck with me of just like, that's right. It's like, we have to approach this of like, this minute or this hour or this day, whatever that time scale is for you, is new. It's not the idea of like, well, you got through the past time scale, the past minute or the past hour, but it helps shift my thinking of like, but now this next one is brand new,
Yeah.
and there gets to be new choices in it, and potentially new growth, and maybe joy, maybe even joy,
Yeah.
you know, if we're fortunate enough to be in position to have that. So yeah. So before we let you go, we want to ask if you have one or two favorite memories of Jen that you'd want to share with us and the
Oh.
audience.
So yeah, my favorite. Ooh, that is tough. But if there's like one story I've told twice now at like the benefit we hold for her every year, is that because it's it's an inappropriate story, but it's hysterical because it has to do with just doing what she loved, going out and seeing concerts.
Mm.
And I dragged her to, not dragged her, she wanted to go, but we went on this trip to Cooperstown to see one of my favorite bands. And it was like right the point of COVID where like it was still less full capacity. So there's still probably like 2,000 people outside in this field in Cooperstown. And her and I were standing in line getting beer, and we had both taken some psychedelics and we were waiting for them to kick in. So we're like facing the stage, but in the beer line, we're parallel. So like she sees flashes and she goes, Jake, I think there's like, you know, a storm coming. And I'm like, no, that's like them just testing out the lights. And then 2 songs in, to the band playing. They literally are playing a song called "Fuck Your Acid Trip." I like could not
No
make
way.
this up. And as soon like this is right as the crowd's like really getting into it, and then they finish, and the lead singer goes, "Hey, do you guys like electricity?" And the crowd goes nuts. And he goes, "Well,
Oh my
you're
gosh.
gonna love that there's a storm coming and we need to evacuate." And
No.
the band leaves, and then this guy comes over the announce speaker, but he's got like the reverb on, so his voice is like echoing. It sounds like he's also on drugs, and he's saying that we have to leave, we have to go to the, you could camp, so we had to go back to our tents. And then no one's moving because we're all like, no, like we can't leave, we're high. And then like security's coming up trying to get us to leave. And the guy's like, you gotta go back to your car. You can't go back to your tent. I'm like, why can't I go back to my tent? And he goes, because it's not grounded. And I was like, well, you're grounded. So, we have to just try to shit together and get out of there. And I remember as we were leaving, one guy was like, man, I can't wait 20 minutes. Like I just took mushrooms. And, like people are leaving
Oh my God.
because of this. And then I remember just her and I being out there just talking to other people, like one of those moments where you're forced to talk to people, not forced to, but you naturally talk to people you never would have. And I remember just laughing so hard to the point. And then, like I remember, trying to look at the Doppler to see if the storm's coming, and it just wasn't working out, to the point where you finally hear the music start again. And we got to just enjoy the music, and it went on longer than it should have. And it was just one of those moments where it was like, you learn to dance through the rain. And, I was so happy to get to share that moment with her. And then, like the next year, she ended up like surprising me with tickets to see that band because of her connections with the music venue. And what was crazy about that is one of the members of the band ended up dying like a month after she died. So it was kind of this, just these beautiful moments that I got to share with her looking back on it, where she cared. Like she ended up buying me this like $150 jacket at one of the shows, where I was just like, it was so much money to me. And she's like, no, like this is, I know how much you love this. And so like things like that, where it just showed how much she like loved the things I loved, like really made a huge difference. So I think that's like the one I would have to pick, because it was just us being, goofy.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Well, we appreciate you sharing your journey. I know I feel like we just scratched the surface of it, but thank you for the vulnerability. Thank you for sharing Jen with us.
No, that's all right. We covered a lot. But I just wanted to say I love what you guys are doing. Like it's not easy. Like I said, from the comedy background, like I know a bunch of people that have tried to do podcasts. It's like a very difficult thing. And what you guys are doing, letting people be vulnerable, is life-changing. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Day After. You can find this podcast and more at our website at www.thedayafter.com. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate if you could take a moment to leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts.